First of all, most of you probably have never done serious comparative history, though I'm sure all of you have been engaged in conversations about issues of how A compares to B and how C compares to D. So let me start with some methodological remarks that I think might help you going forward and help us this morning. First of all, I want to say that I never make moral comparisons. When I compare A to B, it's not to say that A is more terrible than B. Obviously, I only select cases that are terrible. So the point of the exercise is not to talk about morality. Secondly, I eschew as a principle, and I encourage you to eschew it as well, the idea of comparative suffering, that X suffered more than Y. There's no way to quantify suffering, to compare the suffering of a slave mother in Georgia or a Native American mother in Oklahoma or a woman in the Gulag with someone in Auschwitz. There's no way to do that. Also, comparison is very informative. I want to suggest to you that you don't know something until you compare it, but there is a rule to be followed. When you compare two things, as I had a great professor who told me, you should know something about at least one of them. So you'll find that a lot of comparisons are very, very inadequate. They're done more as emotional and ideological than academic exercises. Also, I don't have time to go into it in detail. Perhaps it'll come up in the next session with John Farmer. But the word genocide is very problematic and very difficult. It was coined, as you know, by a man named Raphael Lemkin during the war. He was an international lawyer working for the Carnegie Foundation. He was trying to find a word that would explain what was happening to the Jews of Europe. Genocide, genus means group, side means killing, the killing of a group. Then it became part of the United Nations definition on genocide. That was the problem. The United Nations designed a definition that gave in to political pressure. The Russians didn't want a definition of certain kinds. Americans didn't want another. So we got a wholly unsatisfactory definition, which says the intent to kill in whole or in part a group. The intent is crucial, in whole or in part. The problem is, what part of the part is a part? So if you kill 5%, is that like killing 90%? If you intend only to decapitate, not to exterminate. So I can come back to that, but I put you on notice that you have to be very careful with the word genocide. So, for example, when the International Court heard the Srebrenica case, they had to invent a whole new definition, which turned out to be very inadequate. They tried to explain it to me in a couple of days that we talked, but it's a hopeless business. The other thing I would remind you, and most of you, or a large number of you, are lawyers, that genocide is a legal term, not a moral term. It's become a moral term, so if you want to say something is really bad, you say it's genocide. But the fact is, it's a definition of a specific kind of crime. And it's just, as in medicine, for example, we have a lot of different diseases, right? We have pneumonia and we have tuberculosis. So the same with mass death. We have a lot of different occasions that come forward in the historical record. Also, I should say, when I use the word unique or singular, I want to be very clear. I never use it, as I've mentioned, morally. I always use it logically and phenomenologically. I could give you a sketch. That means if the Holocaust is A, B, C, D, Y, then any event that is A, B, C, D, Y is like the Holocaust. Any event that is not A, B, C, D, Y is not like the Holocaust. So the fact is, one has to be very, very careful in talking about this. Also, my last general comment is that mass death comes in many forms. And you don't want to, it's a great mistake to try to force all of the occasions of mass deaths, only a few of which I'll have time to talk about this morning, into one category, genocide. So, for example, today we have in international law crimes against humanity, which is a very important category. And there are many major occasions of atrocities which count as crimes against humanity. They're not genocide. The most recent, I would say, is the Rohingya in Myanmar. You've all followed that, right? Because they were moved out of Myanmar. They were not as a group cited or intended to be massacred. Now, the historical record, people like to talk about this in the past. I give you only two classical cases, both of which I consider very different from the Holocaust. The first is classical anti-Semitism. Traditional Jews think the classical anti-Semitism and the Holocaust were of no difference in kind. But the fact is, if you're going to deal with anti-Semitism, you have to know two things. One, the essential thrust comes from Christian theology and from the theory of supersessionism, that the church has superseded the Jewish people as God's covenantal partner. And secondly, that the promises given to in the Hebrew Bible have now been taken over by the church, right? So the Jews are the old people, the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, the church is the New Covenant, the New Israel, and so on. Now that in the first few centuries was merely rhetorical. By the first few centuries, I mean the polemic you find in the New Testament, especially the Gospel of John. Jews are the children of the devil, chapter 8:43. And then in the church fathers, every church father wrote an anti-Jewish polemic. But then something very important happened that you all need to know. And that is there arose a man, first Paul, of course, and then there arose a man named Augustine. Augustine is very important to our story because Augustine tried to understand the relation of Judaism and Christianity, and he used a biblical image. He said the relation of Jews to Christians and Christians to Jews is like Cain to Abel. You all know the story. Cain killed his brother Abel, but then God said to the generation of Cain, "Don't touch him. I will punish him. He must wander the earth, and he must carry the mark of Cain." So the Jewish people are like that. They killed their brother Jesus. They killed God incarnate. They're guilty of deicide, but you mustn't kill them. And drawing on the Pauline teachings in Romans 9-11, he talked about the eschatological importance of the Jews being witnesses to the end of time. That's why today, if you want to find the most ardent Zionists, you put on Christian TV on Sunday morning. Right? All the evangelicals believe ardently that we're living in eschatological time, and the creation of the state of Israel is the fulfillment of the prophecies. The ingathering of the exiles will trigger the second coming, and then the Jews will become Christians and will be in the ultimate stage of the world's reckoning. The reason I tell you this is because Augustine's position is you mustn't kill the Jews. So the 11th Christian commandment, despite all the violence of the church against the Jewish people, was never exterminationist. That's why Jews survived from the conversion of Constantine. Remember, Constantine converts the Roman Empire to Christianity at the beginning of the 4th century, all the way down to the Holocaust. 1700 years almost of Jewish history, Jews survived. And they survive because it's a Christian mitzvah to keep them alive. The Pope always interferes to provide protection against blood libels and other kinds of calumnies. So it's very important for you to understand the church is not annihilatory. Their project for the Jews is cultural eradication, conversion, but not physical eradication. The second case I just mentioned, because it throws light on a lot of different things, is the witch craze, right? In the Middle Ages, you know, they were persecuting society. They went after people they called sodomites. They went after witches. They went after religious heretics, so-called Albigensians, Cathars, brothers of the Holy Spirit. But the fact is, what you have to understand about the witch craze is that it was a very serious business. And when you eliminate the crazy ideas that are sometimes advanced by scholars who want to exaggerate, the fact is somewhere between 50 and 100,000 witches were probably burnt at the stake over several hundred years. A very terrible event. And the image that you get from a Disney movie is true. The witch was usually pictured as an old woman without much of a family. And in fact, there are arguments that that's the reason that they were killed. They needed Social Security. If you kill them, you don't have to feed them. So one of the reasons for the witch craze is economic. But the fact is that witches were burnt at the stake. mostly women, 90% women. Only in Iceland was it more men than women. But the fact is that you have a dialectic here. Women have a two-sided nature in Christendom. On the one hand, they're the heirs of Eve. And you all know Eve creates original sin. She tempts Adam to eat the apple. On the other hand, there's a very powerful force in Christendom called Mary. And so the image of women in Christendom is bifocal. It's two-sided. There's Eve and there's Mary. And that's why in the Middle Ages you have a complex situation regarding women. It's a mistake to think that medieval society, though it was heavily prejudiced against women, heavily misogynistic, had alternative ways, right? So the way women were controlled was by becoming members of families. So the husband domesticated, made peace with the Eve that was his wife. Again, you have the idea of the taming of the shrew, right? That women are by nature the children of Satan, but they can be controlled. In addition, women serve as wives, mothers, daughters, saints, nuns. So there are many roles in Christian society which essentially stabilize the otherwise dangerous nature of female character. The result is that I estimate that less than 0.1% of the women in Europe between 1350, say, and 1650 were burnt at the stake or otherwise murdered. So I give you that. We could talk a lot about Albigensians and Cathars and other things, but time prevents. I understand Sabbath comes in tonight about 7:30, so I must be finished by then. That's a joke. Now, the fact is that in the modern period, we also have lots of cases of great evil. Seeing all of us, I think, are from the United States. I'll just give you the two most infamous cases in the United States, which is, of course, Native Americans and black slavery. Now, these are complicated. With regard to Indians, Native Americans, it's very complicated. You need to know that when Columbus arrived in Hispaniola, there may have been as many as 100, 125 million Native Americans in the New World. Very big populations. Most of them in Mexico and South. It's estimated Mexico had a population of approximately 25 million. Many fewer north. Climate wasn't great, right? So you go to Florida. The fact is that the Indians, however, suffered the greatest, I think the greatest demographic tragedy in human history. And that came about, of course, because of microbes, pathogens. There is a set of disease outbreaks which people who study this call virgin soil epidemics. Virgin soil epidemics means that it's an epidemic circumstance where the local population has never encountered the pathogen before. So you don't get a relatively limited amount of death because you have immunity. You get a dramatic amount of loss because you have no immunity. The Native Americans had no immunity to two diseases in particular, smallpox and measles. And therefore, it's estimated that in these first encounters, you could have losses of 70, 80, 90%. And we have people recording in the 16th century. They arrive in a village. No white man has ever been there, but the village is already dead because an Indian had met a European somewhere else, brought home the information, spread the disease, and people died. Now, it's clear that the overwhelming majority of people in the New World died from disease, without intent to murder. I want to stress, without intent to murder. In fact, in many places, the disease preceded the arrival of the Europeans because of the trade routes and other things. And in fact, the other sad, very sad thing that I need to tell you is, who do you think were the most important killers in human history? Who were the most important killers in human history? Who were the most important? What group? Missionaries. Because missionaries came into these villages to convert them, and then they write back. If you read, for example, the Jesuit writings back from Canada to Rome, you see how they're perplexed. We come into the village, everybody dies. Fortunately, we baptized a few, right? So the fact is that missionaries came with the best intentions. They gave up their life. They came 6,000 miles to convert the Indian, to open the doors of salvation, to bring the native pagan to Christ. And what happens? They all die. Not bad intentions, good intentions. And the whole of Southern American history, the history of the Latin American countries, is a history of creating a new civilization by Christian missionaries. They created missions, they created schools, they created kindergartens, they created, of course, missionizing activity, they created hospitals, but everybody dies. So this is not genocide, right? This is mass death. The other thing that I would call to your attention just quickly is that if you look at the history of the conquest, beginning with the conquest of Tenochtitlan, the capital, which is now Mexico City, the great capital of Mexico, about 200,000 Indians by the contemporaries who viewed it, watched it, said died in the battle. But what you have to understand is that there was no real battle. By and large, what had happened is the inhabitants of the city had gotten smallpox. So they were not in a position to fight back. So when the conquistadors came into the city, everybody was dead, largely from disease. And that would be true. The other thing I want to point out, and I spend a little more time because you're all from the United States and will undoubtedly, ever discussing this issue, will be confronted by this example. You need to know that if you look at Spanish imperial policy, the Spanish imperial policy was both Christian and prudential. By Christian, I mean that they recognized there were limits to what you were allowed to do. And secondly, they were prudential. The prudence came from the fact that the new world with all its riches was worthless unless you had workers. So workers were essential. And as the Indians died, the state became more and more interested in passing legislation to keep people alive. First, you had the 1512 laws of Burgos, not very effective. But then 1542, you get the very effective new laws, essentially outlaw slavery. Queen Isabella had already rejected the idea of Indian slavery when Columbus sent Indians back to Spain as slaves. She said, send them home. We want them as vassals. We don't want them as slaves. Governors now came and enforced the rule of no slavery. 1550, there was a famous debate in Valladolid between Las Casas. Do all of you know the name Las Casas? Is there anybody here who doesn't know the name Las Casas? Put your hand up if you don't know. Las Casas was the great hero of the story. He was a descendant of conversos, Jewish converts in Spain. He became a Dominican. He came to America early on with Columbus. He converted, and then he defended for the rest of his life in very powerful polemics the native people. There were enemies, people on the other side who said the Indians are not really human. As Aristotle said, they're zoa organa, they're living tools. Famous debate in 1550 in front of the king. Las Casas put his position. He essentially won the debate. And after that, it was clear Indians were human beings. He got support from the Pope, who passed in the 1530s a couple of important papal bulls. The most important was called Sublimus Dei, 1537. And from there, the combination of the imperial policy to protect Indians, both as Christians and for workers, and the Pope's policy that they were human beings and therefore had to be treated appropriately. Now, of course, none of this has any resonance in the Holocaust, right? All of this attempt to protect the population, to keep it alive, and the policy of survival rather than of eradication is the defining issue, though that's almost never understood. Also, I'll come back to this, but here you already begin to see a very, very common phenomenon of New World history. It's called miscegenation, right? Everybody knows what that is? If you don't, please raise your hand. If you're a little older, I describe it in detail. I'll leave it to John to give you the details. The fact is, miscegenation was a decisive fact. If you look at South American populations today, you'll find that about 50, 60, 70% are either mulatto or mestizo, mixed race, right? Very few European strains, very few Indian strains, and most of the Europeans who are still European strains are recent immigrants from places like Italy in the late 19th century. I mention that because it's also important to our next issue, which is black slavery. Black slavery was a great crime. Unlike the Shoah, it went on for 3.5 centuries in the New World. It involved more people than the Holocaust, and probably more deaths than the Holocaust. Africanists estimate, though the records are very obscure, that perhaps 1 out of 1 or 1 out of 2 or 1 out of 3 people who were captured survived, and the others died in the struggle to be captured. They were then sent on the terrible Middle Passage, which is very important. About 12.5 million African men, women, and children came to the New World through the Middle Passage. The biggest slave-owning society was in Brazil, then the Caribbean islands, and then the United States. The fact is, however, it's something you have to pay attention. Detail is very important. If you look at the statistics, let me go back a sentence. The key to understanding New World slavery, without being Pollyannish, without being overly skeptical, is economic history, right? It's an economic phenomenon. There would be no slavery if there was no profitability. So the whole enterprise, from beginning to end, is designed to produce profit. Now, how do you produce profit? Well, you have to keep people alive. So in the Middle Passage, which is absolutely horrific, the descriptions of the Middle Passage, the smell, the filth, the disease, the hunger, the brutality, I won't go there. But the fact is, you should know that in the 17th century, the loss in passage was about 30%. By the 18th century, 19th century, the loss in passage was in many places less than 10%. Why? Not that the slavers got more humane, but they became more efficient. And the efficiency was what they were after. They were after reducing losses because dead slaves produce no profit. So why go into this enormous elaborate enterprise of building ships in Liverpool to send them to Senegal, to bring African slaves to Curacao, if it's all going to be with no purpose, right? Dead bodies. The other thing that I should say, because of the economic factor here that's very important to understand, is that black slavery, because of the economic motive, lost all sense of moral proportion and essentially was interested in reproduction. So one of the defining features of black slavery in the New World, certainly in America, was reproduction. And that came in many ugly forms. One of the most terribly exploited groups in human history were black slave women. And they were exploited by their owners to force them into sexual relations to have children. If they didn't have children, often they would be sold because they weren't breeding. They had forced sexual relations with their owners, with their overseers, terrible things. In addition, they used to hire other very stout, strong African slaves to come and have sex with women, in the idea already genetic, right? Eugenic, that you'll have a better slave product if the father is a big, strong person rather than a puny little person. In addition, you have here all kinds of issues later on in the history of slavery when slavery is no longer economically viable in the old slave states like Virginia and North Carolina. But what do? They turn to breeding for sale to sell slaves into the new slave territories further south and west. So the whole business of slavery is dominated by economic motives and by this issue of reproduction. The result is, just to give you the number that will make sense to you, about 400,000 people were imported on slave ships into the United States. On the Civil War, there were over 4 million black slaves in the United States, and of course a large percentage of freemen by that time. Now, I give you these early cases and this methodological warning to say these are difficult issues. Now, let me just look at a couple of historical cases of a later period. As for North American Indians, let me just say one thing. The United States has always been confronted, since we became the United States, right, since the Revolution, with a question: are we going to extinguish Indians or not? That's the fundamental question in American history vis-a-vis Native Americans. Are they going to be extinguished, in other words, annihilated, or not? The answer of the U.S. government has always been, we steal everything we can from Indians, but we don't kill them. That's essentially been the policy. Whatever Indians have that's valuable, white men take away. But they don't cross the Rubicon and kill. The Trail of Tears and the deportation from the South was a way for Andrew Jackson to keep the southern Indian tribes alive, despite all the suffering. When they got out west to Oklahoma territory and they got Indian territory, you have to know America made a fundamental decision. The decision was called reservations. By 1870, there were millions of acres, I think it was 196 million acres of Indian land in the United States, and about 200,000 acres of reservations already, right? Now, you know the reservations are the worst place in the United States. They're horrific. People who grow up on them have this terrible alcohol disease. They have the worst statistical rates for all kinds of drug taking and other kinds of medical problems. None of you want to be an Indian. But the fact is, the United States now for 250 years has made a policy of spending a lot of money to preserve reservations because we have not decided to extinguish the Indian population. And today, of course, the Indian population has grown dramatically over the last 25 years to be quite a number of millions. I forget the exact number, so I won't cite one. Now, if you look at other cases of historical note, let me just give you a couple of European cases that are often discussed. You probably all know something about them. The first will be the Armenian case, right? You all know about, anybody who doesn't know what happened in Armenia in World War I? You don't know? Or, you do know, right. So the Armenians, as you know, were killed in large number by the Turks. However, to understand the Armenian case, you have to put it into the right context. Turkey had been a big empire. The Ottoman Empire had been a very big empire throughout the Middle East, controlled a lot of what is today southeastern Europe, Bulgaria, Greece, controlled the Middle East, Egypt, Palestine, Syria, all the countries that you now have as independent countries. They would all be dismembered from the Ottoman Empire and become independent under the League of Nations after World War I. The government of Turkey was taken over by a radical young group called the Young Turks early in the 20th century, and they said enough. We're not going to allow the dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire anymore. We've lost the Greeks, we've lost the Bulgarians, we have nationalism on the rise in Egypt, and we have the international powers want to come in and steal part of our territory. Enough. So we're going to put down any anti-Ottoman Empire activity within the empire itself. Now, who was a threat within the empire? As you know, the empire had been quite a tolerant experiment. They had welcomed Jews, for example, when they were expelled from Spain in 1492. They had a Christian community of sizable kind, and they had Armenian Christians. The Armenian Christians were a large population, probably the largest minority population in the empire. Parenthetically, I would say, if you look at mass murder, you'll usually find that the victim is the largest minority, because they're the most threatening to the majority, right? Smaller groups are not always so violently attacked. Now, what happened to the Armenians? The Armenians, under the influence of nationalism at the end of the 19th, the beginning of 20th century, said, we want to have an Armenia. We want to separate from the Ottoman Empire, and in the northeast, bordering Russia, the eastern vilayets, as they were called, provinces, we want to create an Armenian state. From the end of the 19th and into the early 20th century, you have Armenian national activity in Turkey. You have assassinations of leaders, you have various military attempts, you have killing of police, all kinds of national activity. Now, it certainly didn't warrant the response, but under the cover of war, the Young Turk government, 1915, decided that it was now going to eliminate the Armenian national threat. I stress the word, the Armenian national threat, not the racial threat, not the religious threat, the national threat. In other words, they were not about to parcel up the Ottoman Empire and allow a new state called Armenia to come into being. As all of you know, after World War I, Armenia came into being, and today again, there is an Armenia, right? So what the Turks did was a horrific crime. Today, I think we would call it a crime against humanity. though it's usually mistakenly called genocide. They didn't want to kill all the Turks, all the Armenians. What they wanted to do was to dismantle Armenian nationalism. So what they did is they killed, as the Nazis did, say, in the Ukraine and in Eastern Europe, they killed the leadership, right? If you eliminate the intellectual class, you get rid of the military leadership, you get rid of the political leadership, you kill the academic leadership, the people are headless, they follow orders. An old theory goes all the way back to the Assyrians and the lost tribes of Israel. The fact is that they did this. So what did they do? They deported a large number of, first it's the numbers. It's a complicated story. You always get competition between the victims and the victimizers. The pro-Turkish element says there were a small number, maybe 1 million, 1.2 million. The Armenians say there were about 2 million, 2.5 million. My own figure is about 1.5 to 1.7 million. So it's a sizable population. But what happened was this. The Armenian people were subjected to a horrific barrage in different ways. Remember, 1.5 to 1.7 million. However, you have here, like you have in black slavery, right? Or you have in Native Americans. You need Native American workers so you don't murder them. You need slave labor so you don't murder it. You have various kinds of elements regarding the witch, because she's also a woman that saves them from being destroyed beyond a small number. You have here again a kind of mediation. What's the mediation? You can eliminate the threat, which is Armenian nationalism, without killing all the Armenians. So you do the following. You deport, first of all, you convert Armenians, which of course has no parallel in the Shoah. About 200,000 Armenians are converted to Islam. 3 kinds of people are converted. Women are converted into the harem. Children are converted into Muslim families that adopt the orphans. And the state converts, for example, doctors. It needs physicians. The Armenians are a relatively educated group. There are Armenian physicians. The war is going on. They need them with the army. They convert them. The second thing that happens to Armenians is that you have these terrible forced marches into Mesopotamia. The numbers vary, but I estimate that about 500 to 700,000 Armenians were deported in terrible, terrible circumstances. They would be attacked by these roves of wandering tribal thieves. They would be attacked in the evening. The women would be raped. Terrible, terrible things happened in Armenia and Mesopotamia. But of that, according to Arnold Toynbee, a name I assume most of you know, the great historian who went out to Turkey and wrote a white paper for the British government in 1917, the fact is that about half of the deportation survived. Now, what you have to say about that is that they survived because they were allowed to survive, right? So to say the Turkish government had all control. Had they wanted to murder the entire convoy, they could have murdered it, but they didn't. They just wanted to get them out of the state. They allowed all of this terrible depredations, violence. About half the population survived, and you see that. If you go to the Middle East, you'll find a large Armenian population in Iran, in Syria. Of course, there's the very ancient community in Jerusalem. If you go to Paris, you'll find a large Armenian community. Those of you who know Boston know that in Boston we have a large Armenian community. I believe Detroit has a large Armenian community. So again, you have 200,000 conversions, perhaps 300,000 survival from the marches. Also, very curiously, the largest Armenian population in the empire is in Istanbul, Constantinople, 220,000. It's left alone. It's not persecuted the last few months of the war, and then several 10,000s of the men are deported. But essentially, 200 of the 225,000 Armenians in Constantinople survived the war. Now, when you add all that up, without going into a lot of detail, you have maybe 700 to 900,000 survivors, which means you have between 700,000 and 900,000 deaths, a very terrible crime against humanity, but you don't have the desire to exterminate in its entirety a people, which is what the Holocaust is. What makes the Holocaust, you all saw yesterday, is that there is no exception. So, for example, with regard to labor, people sometimes say, well, what about Jewish labor? But the fact is, all the Jews who were workers temporarily, and that was only about 5%, 5%. The Germans were short of manpower. They brought drafts from all the occupied countries into Germany for the war economy. The Jews were the best labor they could have had because you didn't have to pay them. And they were skilled, and they would want to do anything to save their life, yet you killed 95% of them. Yes, Irvin was a Jews, talked about Hungarian Jews, 437,000 are deported, 1944, spring of 44, 400,000 are murdered, senseless. So every Jew, even if he's temporarily working, the other thing you have to know about Jewish work is compared to work elsewhere, the Nazis had a policy they called Vernichtung durch Arbeit, annihilation through work. So that the kind of work you did was set to murder you within a finite time. It's a famous story of an IG Farben. You know the chemical plant that makes Bayer aspirin, IG Farben? They were one of the great criminals of the war. They hired Jewish labor. But there was an inspection, an IG Farben, an SS man came to the plant at Buna, outside of Auschwitz, the industrial plant, and they said to a Jew, how long have you been here? He said, 6 months. The SS officer said to him, you've been cheating. What he meant was that you were supposed to die after 3 months between the amount of nourishment you got a day, the amount of calories, and the amount of expenditure you were supposed to put out every day. Somehow this man was either getting too many calories or wasn't working hard enough. So Vernichtung durch Arbeit is a very important caveat, addition to your understanding of labor. Then if we look, say, at the Ukraine and the Ukrainian case. This, I don't know, do all of you know about the Ukrainian case? Early 1930s, from 32 to 35, there was a massive loss of life in the Ukraine. Stalin, of course, now controlled the Ukraine. And the Ukraine is crucial to Russia and to that part of the world for a basic reason. It's the wheat producing area, produces the food. In 1928-29, Stalin started to be concerned that there was not enough grain. In addition, he was concerned with socialist ideology. What does socialist ideology say? It says you can't have capitalists. And therefore, he undertook, both in the cities and in the countryside, the Sovietization of the economy, socialized economy. In the countryside, that meant the Soviets imposed collectivized agriculture. And they took the peasant farms that were owned independently and they made them into collectives. The people who owned these farms were called kulaks, K-U-L-A-K-S. Between 1929 and 1932, there was an enormous assault against the kulaks. 3 types of kulaks were defined. About 30%, 40% of all the kulaks would die in deportations, hunger, violence. 60% would survive. But in the Ukraine, it was a peculiar case. You had in the Ukraine, again, the collectivization of agriculture. And therefore, the kulaks did a very, very interesting thing. They burned their crops and they killed their animals because they didn't want it to go to Stalin. The result was that there was a shortage of food coming from the Ukraine in 1932. When Stalin heard that there was a shortage of Ukraine, he said, it's not true, as the kulaks say, that there's a shortage because there isn't enough grain. The shortage is due to what were called in Soviet days wreckers, people who were opposed to the state policy and were hoarding, because they get more money on the black market, were hoarding the wheat and the food supply. So what did he do? He sent in communist agents and he insisted on the quotas being kept for deportation, for export. And in 1 year, 33, 34, even raised the quota. The result was mass famine. Over 3 or 4 years in the Ukraine, about 5 million people died, including about 800,000 or 1 million children. Terrible things happened in the Ukraine. But the object was, of course, to, one, collectivize agriculture, and two, to destroy the twin element that was active in the Ukraine, which was Ukrainian nationalism, like in Armenia. You know, Ukrainians didn't want to be Russian. They wanted to be independent. Same today, right? We're all living with this again. There's an independent Ukraine, now, of course, has a Jewish comedian as its president, which is remarkable, and it has the Putin regime trying to take over the Crimea and the southern parts of the territory, right? Same thing. Geography doesn't change, ladies and gentlemen. So the result is you get 5 million. It's called the Holodomor, which is the name the Ukrainians give it, special crime. But the fact is, 35 million Ukrainians, 5 million deaths, 15% loss, because the object is not to kill Ukrainians. You need Ukrainians to produce the wheat. In addition, if you look at the Gulag, which is a phenomenon those of you old enough to remember will know was once a big issue because of Solzhenitsyn's books in the West, and of course the death of Stalin and Khrushchev. The fact is that in the Gulag you had a mass slavery. Now, why did you have mass slavery? Most people think you had mass slavery because Stalin had a lot of enemies. And it's true. Everybody for Stalin was an enemy. He hated the international community. He hated the heads of the army. That's why 5 million Russian prisoners of war are taken in the first 6 months when the war begins, because he's killed all the Russian officers, senior officers. He was absolutely insane, paranoid. But the fact is that the Gulag was not to get even with his enemies, though he used it that way for a small number. And he had, of course, the show trials, the famous show trials. But the reason was that he needed unfree labor. Why did he need unfree labor? He needed unfree labor because he wanted to industrialize the Soviet Union so they would catch up with capitalist Western Europe and America. But where was the wealth of Russia, the natural resources, the timber, the gold, the uranium? On the far side of Russia, up in the northeast by the Arctic Circle. Nobody wants to go work free labor in the Arctic Circle. So he had to create a workforce. So the Gulag was essentially a slave labor force. With regard to it, you have to know that people were fed according to production. The harder you worked, the more you got, though you may have been killing yourself anyway. In addition, people got sentences with numbers on them, 2 years, 4 years. There was not a lot of death sentence. So, for example, we know that in the early 1940s, when the war started, essentially the Gulag was emptied and all the people were allowed to go into the Russian army. In the early 1950s, Khrushchev, on Stalin's death, liberated about 70% of the Gulag inmates. So the Gulag is a very important phenomenon of terror. But it's not exterminationist of the large percentage. And it's about 10% of the Soviet Union's population eventually will have experience in the Gulag. As for the minority peoples, do you all know he deports 7 minority peoples that he considers enemies? Volga, V-O-L-G-A, Volga Germans, Tatars, Chechens, Ingushi, Muslim peoples. At the end of his years, 1953, when they counted up the 7 deported minorities, they found out that they were short about 20% of what they had been at the beginning. So again, you don't have here any of the 7 nationalities being consciously exterminated. Now, this I tell you all very briefly. I apologize for the brevity. But I do this because what you need to understand is that the Shoah represents something very different, right? The Shoah represents the intentional murder of an entire people, man, woman, and child, based on nothing else but the fact that they have certain inferior blood. Hitler really believed the nonsense of racial theory, that race was everything. Now here you need to understand that race does not mean just biological phenotypes. It doesn't mean what you look like, right? You're 6 foot or 5 foot, you have black hair or brown hair. That's not what race meant in this environment. Those outer conditions, those physical elements, are just the tip of an iceberg. The real significance of race is that race also defines everything in history and everything in human experience. In history, it's race that defines the rise and fall of nations. It defines political reality. And the theory, just to make it simple, goes something like a Hegelian argument. You conquer a people, you're strong, right? Take the Greeks. The Greeks, under Alexander, conquer the world. What happens when they conquer the world? Well, the Greeks are made up of an army of men. They come to the various countries of the Middle East, and what do? They sleep with local women. They produce miscegenated children. They lose the empire. The Romans come along. They conquer the world. They sleep with local women. They lose the empire. The Spaniards come to America as a pure race. They sleep with the local people. They lose the empire, right? The end of the 19th century, according to the theory, there are only two pure races left, Jews and Aryans. Jews, because we've been locked up in ghettos, it's very hard to fornicate through the walls, and the Aryans, because they've never had an empire, right? Never had an empire. There was never a Germany till 1870, when Bismarck created Germany. They were just city-states. Once it now became clear there are two powers, the Aryans had made a terrible mistake. They let the Jews out of the ghettos. The Jews are a vital people. They were controlled by the ghetto. Now they're out of the ghetto. They're free to cause havoc. They take over the markets. They take over the press. They take over the politics. They are dangerous. But it's not only that they take over, that they're aggressive by nature, but they're parasitical. That is to say, the peculiar nature of the Jew is that the Jew lives as a parasite. He doesn't create. He consumes the health of the other. He lives by taking over and destroying that which has been rightfully produced by the other. Therefore, he is a subhuman parasitic creature, a cancer that has to be eliminated. And you can't eliminate it in part, because a part means that some of the racial blood will continue and the race war will reconstitute itself, and so in the future you'll continue to have race war. It's really striking. If you read the micro-histories of a lot of the little German cities, you see how the SS comes into town with a list, and it knows there should be 72 Jews, 12 children. They go out and they try to find the 72. They find 71. The whole of the Reich goes into a panic. One Jewish child maybe survived. The whole damn rancid business would be undone. And Himmler had this strange view that if Aryan women ever had sex with Jewish men, even if the husband who actually produced the seed for the child would have Jewish characteristics. That's how powerful Jewish genetic influence was. So the fact is, you have to understand here a couple of things. One is what race meant. Secondly, the totality of this. There can be no survivor. This is a war of all against all. This is not something that you can put off like the church did because it was cowardly. This is not killing part of the populations because you want to decapitate nationalism. This is not mistreating people because you want to exploit their labor, but you keep them alive because you need them. This is an intentional policy of the utter destruction of an entire people. And in places where there was no real local strength, you know, when you talk about the number of survivors, you find out often it has to do with the strength of local people. So, for example, Denmark has very small loss because of what the local people did. Bulgaria has small loss because of what the local people did. Finland has, small loss because of what the local people did. On the other hand, in places where you have a weak central localized environment, Poland is the paradigm example. There is no Polish government. There's only the German government here in Krakow. Hans Frank is in the castle 15 minutes away from here. You can go visit the castle. That's where the German government, in the general government, the center of Poland was. You have here a circumstance unlike any other circumstance in history. In all the other cases that I've given you, and I can give you others, there is what I call mediation, interest, economic interest, nationalist interest, political interest, sexual interest, lots of different interests. In the Shoah, there's only one interest, and that's the final solution. Endlosing the Judenfrage in Europa, the final solution. That's the only interest. They don't want the Jews to exploit them financially. They don't want to make them slaves. They don't want to negotiate with them for some kind of better political environment. They have no land to take. What's the point? It's not a nationalist struggle. I would also say here parenthetically, people always misunderstand. They call Hitler nationalist. What kind of nationalism is it that an Austrian becomes the Chancellor of Germany, deports the Jews of Rhodes to Polish death camps? Right? What kind of nationalism is that? It's something else altogether. So you have here a situation of unprecedented kind. And as I say, this is not a moral discussion. This is a phenomenological discussion, right? The structure of what happened, what you saw yesterday, which is the apotheosis of this diabolical scheme, is that there is something here that arose and was designed, not by accident, but designed, not by microbes, but by men, to destroy an entire people, and they came close to doing it. That's absolutely true. The policy emerges in steps. When Hitler comes to power, between 33 and 38, he doesn't feel confident enough, and he only has the Jews of Germany, remember, to deal with. Then he has the Anschluss, and he has the Jews of Austria to deal with. But he doesn't control the world stage. There's peace. He's not ready for war. So his plan initially is export or deport. They talked about Madagascar, and he let the Jews of Germany out. What's interesting is that there were about 500 to 550,000 Jews in Germany. About 350 or 400,000 were able to get out. And when the Austrian Jews were taken over after the Anschluss, Eichmann came with the order to get the Jews of Austria to leave. And they left. Almost all the young people in Germany and Austria. By young, I mean your students, right? People in their 20s and 30s, not people my age, who it's harder to do it. You see, yesterday it was just hard enough to get back to the bus. The fact is, the phenomenon of deport. But what happens is, you have to understand what happens. People like Lucy Davidovich, who wrote a book called The War Against the Jews and said in Mein Kampf there's already a plan of extermination, are wrong. And the reason that they're wrong, and Peter is right, is that what you need always to find, if you're going to talk about extermination, is what? You're all deans. What do you always have to have? Money. So you have to have a budget line for extermination. There was no budget line in any German budget for killing. After 1939, however, the situation has changed. The war comes to Poland. They defeat the Polish army in less than a month. They then divide up Poland into three pieces. The western part goes to the Germans. The eastern part, because of the von Ribbentrop Pact, August 24th, 1939, goes to the Russians. The center, which is called the central government, becomes the dumping ground. But they don't kill Jews. They create ghettos, right? So the first ghettos are created in the spring of 1940. The trigger, so what you can say is the following. Every time you make a step, not only in the Holocaust, but in general, you open a door and you close a window, right? There are things that are no longer possible, and there are things that are now possible. So the war makes possible things that were not possible before. Deporting your Jews, putting up ghettos, and so on. But the trigger for mass death, in my opinion, though there's debate about it, but people who don't agree with me just don't understand. The fact is that the key is the Russian war. The invasion of Russia goes so well for the Germans. Initially, they cross the border and the Russians are simply not prepared. Stalin has killed all the senior officers. Stalin has had communist spies tell the government they're coming. He didn't believe them. He's hiding under the bed. So in the first 6 months, they reach Leningrad, the outskirts. They reach the outskirts of Moscow. And the Einsatzgruppen already killed 500,000 people, starting up in Lithuania all the way to the Ukraine. Right? You all know the Einsatzgruppen, the murder squads. In September 1941, we have the following. When the Soviet Union was collapsed, 1989, the archive of the KGB was opened. And we found in the KGB archive a diary, the daily diary of Heinrich Himmler. And they had taken it, that the Russians had committed and sent it back. And we find that there were 3 days in September 1941 where Himmler and Hitler, very, very unusual, spend the entire days together. And then I'll come back to it, but my guess is that's when the final solution was decided. Because after that, if you look at what happens throughout the Nazi Empire, you see the rules are changed. Instead of letting Jews be exported, So, for example, say you're a Jew from Spain. Spain is neutral, right? Franco is an ally, but he's neutral. They would let Jews from Spain go back to Spain. But now they're not going to let them go back. They're going to kill them all. So he then calls, we have the record of Heuss, who is the head of the commandant of Auschwitz, that Himmler calls him in the fall of 41 to build Auschwitz. The death camp starts to operate in the spring of 42, though the testing is done late in 41, the Zyklon B. So that's what happens. It's staging. So Peter's absolutely right. You know, what was the mindset in the 20s was not the mindset in 33. What the mindset was after the Nuremberg laws was different than before. What was true after Kristallnacht. Remember, Kristallnacht is very important, because once you commit the public violence, you've crossed a crucial level. It's not gemütlich for the German government to break store windows, right? That's not a German state policy. It has to be different. And then the war starts, 39 new possibilities from the ghettos, 41 the possibilities because of war with Russia. So Peter was, you know, yes, thank you. Any other? Yes, sir.
Could you talk a little bit about the Nazis and the Roma?
Yes.
During, at Auschwitz, I think most of us noticed a memorial to the Roma.
The Roma are, as you know, what are usually called the Gypsies, Roma, Zigeuner in German. The Zigeuner were a problem also for the racial and social theory of the Nazis. And here you see again mediation, this word I just used to describe intervening phenomena. The Roma represented a problem. They represented a problem because in the German leadership, there were people who thought that they were racial inferiors, like the Jews, and therefore they should be destroyed. And you see, for example, at Auschwitz, there was a gypsy camp, and they were killed when there was an outbreak of typhus. On the other hand, it's a very curious thing. There was also in the German leadership a group that didn't think they were racial criminals, thought they were social criminals. By social criminals, it means that their way of life is undesirable. They're prostitutes, they steal, they do all kinds of things that are undesirable. Why do they do it? Not because it's in their blood, but because of the social conditions in which they live. They don't have permanent homes, the children don't go to school, they don't get normal cultural values. The one who believed that, especially, and it mattered, was a man named Heinrich Himmler. Heinrich Himmler believed that they're organized, the Zigeuner are organized by tribes, that some of the major Zigeuner tribes, especially the Sinti and the Laleri, were Aryan gypsies. Because where do the gypsies come from? India. Come from India. Where does the Nazi symbol of the swastika come from? India. When you go to India, you'll see everywhere you think you're in 1935 München. But the fact is that because they're not racial elements, you don't have to kill them. What do you have to do? You have to socialize them, right? Just like the communists thought, what do you have to do with capitalists? You don't have to kill capitalists. You have to send them for, quote, re-education. Even today in China, we have re-education camps where they're re-educating people who hold anti-government positions. The result was that they didn't know what to do. And in the end, that was a crucial thing. There were about 837,000 Zigeuner in occupied Europe. About 237,000 were murdered, right? About a quarter, 23.5%. The other 76.5% were not murdered. If you compare that, for example, yesterday you saw the film about Thessalonica. There were 58,000 Jews in Thessalonica, 56,000 were killed. In Poland, I think it was Wlocław who mentioned that there were 3.4 million Jews in Poland, and at the end of the war there were 50,000, right? That's 1%, 1.5%. And the larger number that came back distorts the figure because they were safe in the Soviet Union. Of those who were actually hiding in Poland, working in Poland, 1.5%. Less than 1% of Jewish children. So the Zigeuner are very important, but it's a different phenomenon. The same with homosexuals, the same with Jehovah's Witnesses, the same with other groups, deaf and dumb, right? People who were considered to be physically unable in the Reich. The Reich had a series of what we might call racial policies or genetic policies better, but they weren't all the same. They varied from one group to the other. And the Jews, of course, had no redeeming qualities. They weren't asocial. They were just verminous, so they had to be destroyed. Does that explain the situation?
In some countries, gypsies were absolutely safe. For instance, in Slovakia, which of course deported all its Jews, the gypsies were perfectly safe. Many of them, a good part of them, were acculturated. They had jobs, they had domiciles, so this is not a problem at all. In fact, in my little town, there was a group of gypsies who, one of the Jewish young men married one of the gypsy girls, and they saved him. So the gypsy policy depends upon where, when, the acculturation. There was also gypsies in the German army.
Right. There were gypsies at the end of the war. They drafted Zigeuner into the Wehrmacht.
Right.
So
So it's a totally different
it's a
kind
different,
of thing.
you know, they have, the German state is built on racial policy from top to bottom. Every office has a racial expert, so-called. So for him, every issue is racial. For everybody else, it might be social, it might be economic. So there's this competition within the hierarchy as to what to do in every given case. With the Jewish question, there's no hierarchy of differences of opinion, essentially. Yes, please. Yes,
Well, I just learned yesterday, after our dinner, that there was an Indian SS, Waffen-SS unit, actually. So going back to what you said, sometimes it's not about race, it's not about socioeconomics and so forth, it can be about nationalistic. So
Right.
the Indians were trying to get rid of the Brits, and they had a nationalistic unit, and they put it at the disposal of the German army. And I saw it yesterday on France 24 because they're
Also-
preparing programs. So a Waffen-SS unit from the Indians. You know, that is amazing. But I have a question. Yeah, sorry.
this is also in the Arab world, right? The Mufti of Jerusalem, al-Husseini, becomes an ally of Hitler because he wants to kill the Jews of the Middle East. And he goes to Berlin and he gives radio talks about the German Reich, and he forms an SS Legion from Muslims. So these peculiar things, because you have to remember, this was a remarkably complicated worldwide campaign in a way. Everybody doesn't have the same ambition as the Germans, right? They're not all having the same ambition, but they have their own ambitions. But they take their ambitions and they piggyback them on the German ambitions. So you get these complicated mixes of action and lack of action, policy and limits, right? Hungary is the classic case. Under Horthy, they have nationalist interests, but they don't murder their Jews till Eichmann comes to deport the Jews in the spring of '44. So you have to look carefully, and if there were time, you don't talk about the Holocaust as a block, as a monolith, and as monocausal, only anti-Semitism. It's pluralistic. There are all kinds of different issues and all kinds of causes. Some people are greedy, some people want an advancement in their careers, some people are racist, some people are Christian anti-Semites. So these are complicated issues that Urban raises. Please, any? Yes, did you pay
I just
for
had
two
a
questions?
question. Yeah, I had a comment and a question. So, indeed, just to capitalize on what you just said, I live in Belgium, as you all know, and I live on the Flemish side of the country. So, Dutch speakers, they have been fighting for 100 years for their independence, actually, and they're still fighting for that. And they just joined the German cause, so to speak, because they saw an opportunity for them to advance their cause. And actually, there's one guy who's still alive, your age, by the way, Irvin, who is a sympathizer of one of the last survivors of the Waffen-SS from the Flanders, who is sympathizing with the most powerful political party in Belgium as I'm speaking to you right now. And we are in election time, so in like 3 weeks from now, they are projected as being the most powerful political party, the NVA. It's a nationalistic party. So I just had one question. One of the voters of this party is my neighbor. He got for Christmas Mein Kampf as a present, and he's reading Mein Kampf, and he's telling me about it once in a while, and so forth. Mein Kampf right now is one of the best sellers in Belgium and in other countries. Believe it or don't believe it. So they read it without comments, without commentary, without being accompanied into the analysis of the book. So my question to the historian, what do you think about Mein Kampf being sold as a bestseller in 2019?
The reason it's become a bestseller is there was a debate in German historical circles. And the German Historical Institute, which is a very reputable, honorable group of historians, were being pressured with the question you just asked. And they decided that what they had to do so that you wouldn't get unedited, uncommented on copies of Mein Kampf, they had to produce, after much conversation, they had to produce an annotated version. So if Hitler says something, then you go down the page and you see an explanation or some disagreement or argument against it, right? So what they were trying to do was to produce a copy that would be anti-Mein Kampf. But they misjudged. It's a bestseller. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies now. Not that long ago, I had a very sad conversation with one of the editors who was bemoaning the lack of outcome that they expected. They thought it was going to have a pedagogical influence that would be good. Instead, they have hundreds of thousands of people reading Mein Kampf who would never read it. So it's very hard to control this. I remember there was a wonderful historian in New York once when I was a young man, and I said to him, I think I'm going to write something about the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Do you know what that is? Does everybody know what the Protocols of the Elders of Zion? The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, next to Mein Kampf, is the most infamous anti-Semitic book in history. It was produced in 1903 in Russia, paid for secretly by the Tsar's purse through the underground spies that he had, and they took a story that was originally centered around the Masons as an international conspiracy, and they revised it as a Jewish conspiracy to take over the world. In 1916, the London Times did an investigation. They wrote that it's true. In the 1920s, it was published by Henry Ford in the United States. He bought a newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, so he could serialize it in the newspaper. Today, if you go to Muslim countries, you'll find it on every newsstand. Henry Kissinger once had a delegation come from Saudi Arabia that brought him a gold-bound copy of the Protocols because he should understand what was really happening. They didn't realize that he was the elder of the elders. So the fact is that this is an infamous book, infamous. And the man said to me, the very distinguished professor of Columbia, he said to me, Stephen, don't read it, don't touch it. No matter what you do, it won't have the desired result. And it's true. Today, we have all kinds of theories. We have a theory that the Protocols was written by people from outer space who came to Earth. It's a popular book in Japan. It's unbelievable. You can't control this, and that's where the internet, and we discussed it at dinner. You're going to say something this morning. The fact is, our greatest enemy today are not right-wing nationalist groups in Kansas, right? In America, Kansas used to be the center for this. I apologize for this kind of activity. Plain black rappers, you would get a copy of the Protocols. But the fact is, it's the internet. You could be sitting in London and listening all day to schmutz coming from Damascus. Do you all know the term schmutz? It's a technical term, very important. So the fact is, you need to understand we're in a whole new world where social media, and especially the internet, has become our greatest enemy. How to solve it, I have no idea. People are working on it. They did The Guardian. There was a courageous journalist at The Guardian a few years ago, went on the web, and he put the word in Jewish or something, and the first 10 sites that he was sent to were all anti-Semitic sites. The way the program, the algorithm worked. He called it to the attention of The Guardian. Being honorable, it only is 9 now. The fact is, the phenomenon of hate is all around us. It makes its way into our homes. in ways that we never imagined could be possible. It's extremely difficult to figure out a way to restrict, to block, to destroy, but those are the issues we face. Thank you very much.